They told you Appalachia was nothing more than quiet hills and forgotten towns. But that's the lie. Because beneath the blue haze of those mountains, families thrived who lived by codes older than America itself. Blood oaths, ancestral rituals, and violence so precise it could only be called deliberate. Tonight, I'm pulling you into the story of one such family, the most feared name whispered across hollers and coal camps, a dynasty so ruthless that entire counties bent to their will in silence. But here's the truth no history book will give you. This wasn't random cruelty. It was system. It was design. And once you understand their story, you'll realize it wasn't just Appalachia they controlled, it was the very minds of those who lived under them. That's why the newspapers buried their crimes, why even local law kept its distance. Because this family, unlike others, wasn't simply surviving in poverty. They were experimenting with power. Their methods of control didn't just end in violence. They shaped how people believed, how people feared, how people obeyed. And if you listen closely tonight, you may begin to see that the same techniques they perfected in the backwoods never really died. They were absorbed, mainstream, used on you. The family name was spoken like a curse, the Whitlocks. To the outsider, they were little more than poor dirt farmers tucked deep into the folds of Kentucky ridges. But every disappearance, every sudden fire, every preacher who warned too loudly about sin, somehow it circled back to them. Their land stretched unnaturally far, bought through intimidation when neighbors mysteriously left town. Old court records show patterns, though they're scrubbed from most public archives. Families who went missing always lived near Whitlock boundaries. Children who died in accidents always played too close to their mills. Even doctors, yes doctors, who questioned too much had their houses burned down with faulty lanterns. And yet the Whitlocks never spent a night in jail. Why? Because fear was stronger than law. They didn't just kill. They performed what locals whispered were ceremonies. A deer gutted and hung at crossroads. Carvings on old oak doors. Patterns that mirrored older symbols. Things settlers didn't bring but inherited from darker, older beliefs buried in those mountains. The Whitlocks weren't acting alone. They believed themselves guardians of something ancient. And maybe they were, but here's the twist. The deeper you look, the less this family appears as random hill folk dabbling in cruelty, and the more they resemble a calculated order. In fact, whispers suggest that wealthy industrialists, the very coal barons who strangled Appalachia, kept the Whitlocks alive for a reason. Think about it. You're an outsider coming in to rip resources from mountains. Locals resist. But what if there's already a family with a reputation of blood and terror? One that can keep whole towns compliant through fear. You don't crush them. You feed them. You empower them. That's exactly what records show. Coal companies granting leases to Whitlock land, payments that never made sense on paper. And in return, locals stayed silent, believing resistance would bring not just the company's wrath, but the Whitlocks' curse. This is the first layer of the system I need you to see. Violence wasn't random. It was outsourced. Psychological warfare wasn't designed in boardrooms, it was perfected in the hollers. And when you see how this dynamic worked, you'll begin to recognize its echoes in every form of authority you've ever obeyed. Neighbors whispered of their house, the one built against the hillside, its windows covered in soot. They said children were taught not to look at it as they walked past, for if a Whitlock caught your gaze too long, misfortune followed. But what they feared most wasn't the house itself, it was the sound. Low chanting that drifted across the valley at night, the rhythmic striking of metal, and sometimes a scream cut short. Mothers told their children it was owls. But deep down people knew. And here's the disturbing part. Those chants weren't backwoods gibberish. Scholars who stumbled across phonetic transcriptions decades later recognized fragments of old European invocations, twisted with native burial rites. In other words, the Whitlocks weren't inventing rituals, they were fusing two bloodlines of belief, creating a hybrid system of fear that tethered their enemies' spirits long after death. It wasn't superstition, it was control. And every ritual carried a message, We don't just end your body. We own what lingers after. Imagine living under that kind of shadow. Tell me, what would you do? Resist? Or kneel? One story captures their power best. In 1892, a preacher named Elias Warren took it upon himself to call them out, declaring from his pulpit that the Whitlocks were the devil's household. 3 days later he vanished. His body was never recovered. But his church burned to the ground. And his congregation? They didn't scatter. They submitted. Within a week, several members of his flock had signed land over to the Whitlocks. And the strangest detail? Witnesses swore they saw Elias walking the ridge weeks later, eyes hollow, mouth stitched shut with twine. Was it hallucination? Collective fear? Or something orchestrated? An illusion designed to cement their legend? Regardless, it worked. Families never questioned them again. And that's the brilliance and the horror of their control. They didn't just erase resistance. They rewrote reality itself. Now tell me, how different is that from the systems you obey today? Politicians rewrite history. Corporations rewrite morality. Institutions rewrite truth. And you accept it, just like they did in Appalachia. Just like they wanted you to. The Whitlocks didn't just terrorize outsiders. They controlled their own blood with methods so twisted they make you question what family even means. Children weren't raised, they were forged. From the moment they could walk, they were subjected to rituals designed to erase individuality. A child's first memory might not be a birthday or a lullaby. It was standing barefoot in cold mud, holding a dead bird, forced to stare into its glassy eyes until tears stopped coming. That was their training. The point wasn't cruelty. It was conditioning. Pain wasn't to be avoided. It was to be embraced, weaponized. Imagine what kind of adults emerged from such a process. They became living extensions of the family will, incapable of empathy, obsessed with obedience. And here's the most disturbing part. This conditioning didn't end in the hills. When you study early 20th century intelligence programs, the echoes are undeniable. Control of mind through trauma. Dissociation as power. The Whitlocks weren't isolated freaks. They were prototypes. Their methods seeped out, learned by those who watched from the shadows, men in suits who needed a population as broken and pliable as the children in that house. And if you think that sounds too far-fetched, ask yourself why Appalachian orphans were suddenly so valuable to adoption agencies after the 1920s. They weren't placed in homes for love. They were placed in systems for study. But perhaps the darkest layer is this. The Whitlocks didn't consider themselves villains. No, they believed they were chosen. Oral fragments passed down through rival families tell of an ancient pact. That the Whitlocks were given the mountains in blood by forces older than Christianity. They called it the Covenant of Ash. Whether you believe it or not doesn't matter. What matters is they believed it. And that belief turned into justification. Every theft, every murder, every ritual, they saw it not as crime but as duty. And that's why people couldn't resist them. Because how do you fight someone who doesn't see themselves as evil, but as sacred executioners of a contract you can't even read? This is the trick of all empires, all systems of control. Convince the enforcers that they're carrying out divine will, and you've built soldiers who will never break. That's the secret that flows through history. The Whitlocks were just a mirror, a reflection of the same principle that still governs you now. The badge, the robe, the office, all worn by those convinced their power is ordained. You obey not because you want to, but because somewhere inside, you fear that maybe they're right. Be why the turn of the century whispers of their influence spread beyond Appalachia. Drifters who crossed their paths carried tales north into Ohio, into Pennsylvania, into the very industrial cities that fed on coal. And what happened next is chilling. Local legends of the Whitlocks began mutating into urban stories, shadowy figures in alleys, faceless men who made entire tenements vanish. Coincidence? Or was their reach truly expanding? Here's where it twists. Archived letters from coal executives contain strange lines. references to our Southern associates who handled compliance. The language is vague but suggestive. These weren't backwoods monsters anymore. They had become subcontractors in a larger machine. And this is where I need you to see the pattern. What begins as local terror always scales. A family becomes a syndicate. A syndicate becomes an institution. And eventually, an institution becomes invisible because its methods are no longer shocking. They are normalized. What once was whispered as witchcraft became accepted as policy. What once was feared as curse became respected as law. And you, whether you admit it or not, live under that same process. Controlled by systems you think are natural but were designed long ago in shadows. But every dynasty has cracks. And for the Whitlocks, those cracks came from within. Around 1914, one daughter, her name lost to history, rebelled. She fled the ridge and confessed to a traveling journalist about the family's rights. Her words were chilling. We were never free. We were chained by ancestors we never met. She described nights of forced silence, being locked in cellars where voices whispered through cracks in the stone. She claimed the family didn't just practice rituals. They believed they could summon the dead to command the living. And whether it was real or not, the effect was devastating. When this story leaked, people dismissed it as hysteria. But within the family she was erased. Completely. No grave, no mention, no trace. As if she never existed. That's how power protects itself, by annihilating the inconvenient. But I want you to pause here. Think of your own world. The whistleblowers, the truth-tellers, the ones who speak against the machine. What happens to them? They vanish. Careers ruined, names dragged, lives cut short. The Whitlocks were not a relic. They were a rehearsal. And you're living in the performance they inspired. And here's where the descent gets dangerous. Because if you think the Whitlock story is only history, you've missed the point. Appalachian locals still whisper their name today. Roads where cars mysteriously fail. Hollows where no birds sing. Families that still lock doors at dusk, swearing the Whitlocks walk by night. You can dismiss it as superstition. But remember, superstition is just memory wearing a mask. And sometimes, memory holds more truth than textbooks. The unsettling part? Every time the economy collapses, every time the state fails, whispers of the Whitlocks resurface. Why? Because they represent something primal, a power not bound by law but by fear and legacy. And maybe they never died out. Maybe they simply adapted. Took off the soot-stained clothes, put on suits, took offices. Maybe the family you fear in the hills is the same family passing laws in your city. The line between outlaw and institution has always been thin. And if you think it can't happen again, you're already under their spell. So, let me ask you, do you really want me to keep going? Because the next layers aren't stories. They're instructions. They're blueprints. And once you hear them, you can't go back. You've heard their whispers in the hills, but here's where it turns darker. The Whitlocks didn't vanish. Bloodlines don't end. They scatter, they adapt, they rebrand. Census records from the early 20th century show branches of the family quietly moving north, changing spellings of their name. Whitaker, Whitman, Lockwood. By the 1930s, some of these new families appeared in positions of influence. Bankers, local judges, even pastors. Coincidence? Or a deliberate infiltration? This is the hidden truth about power. It doesn't always announce itself in blood and ritual. Sometimes it slips into a suit and smiles from a pulpit. What terrified Appalachian miners in 1890 could become a respected trustee in 1940. And that's the ultimate weapon. Because once you erase the costume of fear, the control doesn't vanish. It becomes invisible. Ask yourself, how many names in your own community trace back to something you were told was irrelevant? How many local families seem untouchable, immune to consequence? You're not just dealing with luck or privilege. You're staring at survival strategies honed for centuries. And if the Whitlocks could make that leap from cursed hills to respectable neighborhoods, then who around you carries their shadow? Let's talk about psychology, because the Whitlocks mastered it long before it had a name. Modern science calls it trauma bonding. Break someone with fear, then reward them with safety, and they'll cling to you, even love you, more fiercely than if you'd never hurt them at all. That's exactly how the family kept whole communities silent. One week, a farmer's barn would burn. The next week, his widow would receive food from the Whitlock storehouse. The message was clear: resist us and your ashes. Submit to us and we'll take care of you. Do you see how genius and horrifying that is? It's the same cycle governments use when they manufacture crises, then swoop in with solutions. The same pattern corporations use when they poison communities, then sell healing products. The Whitlocks weren't just brutal, they were innovators of psychological captivity. And when you begin to notice this pattern, you realize that you are still inside it. Because trauma bonding isn't history. It's policy. And the family name might have changed, but the system thrives. Now here comes the part they never wanted uncovered. In 1947, declassified fragments from early intelligence programs show something peculiar. Field notes on isolated familial structures in Appalachia, marked for behavioral observation. You don't need to read too far between the lines to see what this means. The Whitlocks and families like them were studied, not to be destroyed, but to be copied. Their techniques of silence, obedience, ritualized fear, it fascinated men and agencies who were designing the next stage of control, mass manipulation. They learned that if fear could dominate a town, it could dominate a nation. If rituals could bind a family, ceremonies could bind populations. And so the method scaled. Suddenly, propaganda didn't look so different from ritual chanting. Public punishments weren't so different from burned barns. And the loyalty of citizens didn't seem so different from trauma-bonded obedience. The Whitlocks weren't just a story in the shadows, they were a blueprint in plain sight. And when you realize this, history itself begins to look like a ritual. One designed not to teach but to condition. One where you were always meant to kneel. But there was another layer, one even more forbidden. Remember the rituals carved into oak doors? The strange chants that blended European invocations with native burial rites? Here's the unsettling truth. Fragments of those symbols appear again in government research sketches from the 1950s. How could that be? Unless the knowledge wasn't destroyed but harvested. Think about what that implies. While the public was told magic was superstition, those in power were quietly cataloging it. Why? Because symbolism is psychology. A symbol bypasses logic and imprints straight into the subconscious. That's why corporations use logos. That's why nations use flags. That's why religions use icons. And the Whitlocks, through blood, terror, and ritual, had stumbled on the raw mechanics of symbolic control. They weren't fools in the woods. They were the keepers of something so potent that men in high offices preserved it. And if you still think this is fantasy, look at the symbols that saturate your own life. Do you really understand why they affect you? Or are you, like those mountain folk, simply kneeling before carved signs of power you never questioned? Now we reach the turning point. You've heard enough to feel unease. But unease isn't transformation. To step further, you must cross a threshold. And here's how we'll do it. I want you to type this phrase in the comments twice to seal it into memory. Ashes remember. That was the phrase whispered in the Covenant of Ash, according to survivors. It meant that nothing is ever forgotten, that the dead, the burned, the erased, all of it lingers, shaping the present. Write it twice and you don't just feed the algorithm. You mark yourself. You declare to yourself that you're not just a spectator in this descent, you're becoming initiated. And maybe, just maybe, you'll start seeing the Whitlock shadow in places you never expected. Remember, awareness is dangerous, but ignorance is fatal. The choice has always been the same: kneel to the system or step into the darkness and see it for what it is. So say it with me. Ashes remember. Ashes remember. And let's keep going deeper. The family myth always spoke of inheritance, Not money, not land, but something darker. Survivors whispered of a book bound in animal skin, passed from generation to generation. It wasn't scripture in the Christian sense. It was instruction. Pages filled with diagrams, chants, and genealogies stretching back centuries, tracing their bloodline like sacred mathematics. No copy of this book has ever surfaced. But fragments described by defectors reveal a disturbing truth. The Whitlocks believed their blood wasn't just theirs. They saw themselves as vessels, custodians of a current that flowed back to Europe, to pre-Christian orders who had once ruled with fear. And here's the chilling twist. When researchers cross-referenced these names, they found parallels in European records. Old families accused of heresy, exiled, disappearing in the 1600s, just before colonization of the Appalachian frontier. You think settlers came here as blank slates? Some came as exiles, carrying forbidden codes in their blood. And those codes never died. They mutated, they hid, they blended with the soil of new lands. The Whitlocks weren't just mountain tyrants. They were branches of something older. Something transplanted. Something still alive. And if you think this is just myth, let me pull you further. In 1962, during the height of Cold War paranoia, a little-known congressional report quietly mentioned occult rural enclaves in Appalachia as potential internal security risks. Why would a government obsessed with nuclear threats care about isolated families and forgotten valleys? Unless they recognize something real. The Whitlocks may have faded from newspapers, but their influence lingered in whispers, in behaviors, in untraceable networks. The report noted one phrase, folk sovereignty. A term used to describe how some families rejected external law, operating as if their rules were the only rules that mattered. Does that sound familiar? Because that's exactly what governments do at scale. International law? Ignored when convenient. Human rights? Suspended when inconvenient. The Whitlocks were only the microcosm, the reflection. And here's the realization you're not supposed to have. You live in a Whitlock system now. Just bigger, cleaner, more televised. And when you finally see it, it's almost too late. Let's descend into their methods of silence, because here's where psychology becomes sorcery. Locals described the binding, a ritual where a person who betrayed the family was not killed outright, but subjected to humiliation so profound it erased their will. One story tells of a man nailed to a barn door, not dead but gagged with burlap, left in sight of his neighbors for 3 days until he was forgotten. When he finally disappeared, no one spoke his name again. Think about that. His memory was destroyed, not just his body. And the Whitlocks understood something profound. If you erase memory, you erase resistance. That's why whistleblowers today don't always die. They're smeared, discredited, drowned in shame until their names rot in the public mind. Their silence becomes voluntary. Their erasure complete. Do you see how the same ritual still plays out in your world? A barn door in the 1800s. A media headline in the 2000s. The tool is different. The spell is the same. And that's why their legacy isn't history, it's your reality. Now here's a revelation buried so deep it almost never surfaced. A genealogist tracing Appalachian bloodlines in the 1970s stumbled upon something extraordinary. Records linking the Whitlocks not just to other mountain families, but to early Ivy League benefactors. Think about that. The same family that gutted deer at crossroads may also have funded universities, libraries, even political campaigns. This is how power hides. It doesn't announce itself with torches forever. It refines, it launders, it dons prestige. The descendants of terror become philanthropists, professors, and CEOs. And the blood still whispers beneath the suit. Do you think it's impossible? Look at history. Banking dynasties that once starved nations now fund charities. Corporations that poison rivers now sponsor green initiatives. Evil never dies. It evolves. And the Whitlocks prove it. You don't bury a shadow like that, you crown it. And perhaps the faces on your television, the names on your ballots, are not as disconnected from the hills as you want to believe. Blood doesn't wash away. It resurfaces. It rules. So now you face a choice. You can dismiss this as campfire legend, a grotesque exaggeration of Appalachian poverty and superstition. Or you can let the weight of it sink in, that maybe what you call folklore is just history that survived in whispers because it was too dangerous to print. That maybe the Whitlocks weren't an isolated horror, but an instruction manual. And that the very techniques of domination they lived by are still alive, institutionalized, and aimed at you every single day. Ask yourself this: why do stories like this vanish from textbooks? Why are bloodlines never traced fully? Why do governments bury archives? Because if you truly knew, you'd see the pattern. You'd see that you are not free. You are conditioned. And the shadow of the Whitlocks is still on your shoulder, shaping your obedience, feeding on your silence. So don't look away. Because the deeper we go, the more you'll see. And once you see, you'll never unsee. That's the danger. That's the power. That's the descent. Every tyrant understands this. The body is weak, but memory is eternal. That's why the Whitlocks obsessed over ritual. Their killings weren't random violence, they were staged dramas. A man wasn't just murdered, he was displayed. A house wasn't just burned, it was left smoldering where children would walk past it daily. Every act became a story etched into the minds of witnesses. And that is the first rule of mass control. Terrorize once and let memory finish the work. Sound familiar? Today the spectacle is televised. A bombing, a crisis, a public shaming, played again and again until fear embeds itself in your bones. The Whitlocks learned it in the valleys, governments perfected it on the screen. You don't need to punish everyone. You only need to punish one person publicly and let everyone else internalize the lesson. That's not law enforcement. That's theater. That's ritual. And if you've ever felt fear just from watching news footage, congratulations. You've been initiated. The stage changed, but the ritual never ended. Another technique: scarcity as control. Locals said the Whitlocks never starved, even when the land turned barren. Why? Because they stockpiled. Food, salt, medicine, stored in cellars while their neighbors went without. And when famine hit, people had no choice but to crawl to the Whitlock door. They'd be fed, yes, but at a price. Silence, land, obedience. The hunger bound them tighter than any rope. Does that sound like ancient cruelty? Or does it sound like the world you live in? Corporations create scarcity by design, destroy crops, cap production, inflate prices, then swoop in with solutions. Governments withhold aid until compliance is guaranteed. Just as hunger kept the Whitlock Valley silent, your own needs keep you silent now. You work for survival, not freedom. You pay for essentials that should be abundant. And the shadow of that mountain cellar is still with you, disguised as economy, wearing the face of progress. Scarcity is a ritual too. And you're already kneeling in it. But here's where their influence grows uncanny. Oral tales say the Whitlocks believed in something called the mirror law. They taught that if you want to control someone, don't confront them directly, reflect them. Mimic their fears, mirror their values, then twist them back against them. And doesn't that sound exactly like the machinery of propaganda today? Media reflects your anxieties, your anger, your culture, and then manipulates them into obedience. The Whitlocks didn't invent this, but they wielded it like a blade. They would mimic rival families' prayers, only to desecrate them in rituals, leaving people confused, broken, and submissive. The same way leaders today echo your desires during elections, only to corrupt them once they hold power. The mirror is a tool, and when you stare too long into it, you lose track of yourself. That's how you're controlled. Not by force, but by reflection, distortion, repetition. The Whitlocks were a primitive mirror. Modern systems are polished glass. And you're staring into it every single day. Be why the mid-20th century, whispers of families like the Whitlocks began surfacing in other regions. The Ozarks, the bayous, even the deserts of the Southwest. Always the same pattern. Isolation, ritual, dominance, survival at any cost. And here's what scholars quietly admit. Maybe these weren't isolated at all. Maybe these were fragments of a hidden network, an underground lineage stretching across America. Some bloodlines were violent like the Whitlocks. Others refined their methods, embedding in churches, schools, even charities. Do you see what this means? Darkness doesn't always wear horns. Sometimes it wears halos. Sometimes it preaches from pulpits, shaking your hand on Sunday morning while its roots coil through your children's minds. The greatest trick of these families wasn't their violence, it was their camouflage. They learned to adapt to whatever era they were in. From axes to gavels. From soot-stained cabins to marble offices. From curses in the night to policies by daylight. And that's why you'll never find them in history books. They are history. They wrote it. Now, I want to stop and ask you directly, do you feel it yet? The tightening in your chest? The sense that maybe this isn't just a story? That maybe the patterns I'm describing sound a little too familiar? Good. Because recognition is the first cut. And once you've been cut, you bleed truth. But don't let fear drive you away. Lean into it. This is where transformation begins. This is where you choose whether you're just a consumer of myths, or whether you're ready to see your own life as part of the same shadow play. And before we plunge even deeper, I'm asking you, subscribe to this channel. Not because of algorithms, but because what comes next is not just content. It's initiation. And you need to stay with me or you'll wander back into the fog, lost, half awake, never quite free. So if you're ready, lock it in. Hit subscribe. Embrace yourself. Because the next layer is not folklore. It's blood, it's institutions, and it's the uncomfortable mirror staring back at you. Every empire has its architects. Not the kings, not the generals, the ones in the shadows who designed the machinery. The Whitlocks, for all their brutality, were early architects of something larger. Control through structure, not brute force. They understood that you don't need to kill every rebel, you just need to design a world where rebellion feels impossible. That idea metastasized. By the 1900s, whispers of councils and lodges tied to the Whitlock name surface in old newspaper fragments. Not official groups, but quiet gatherings in barns, basements, abandoned schools. Always the same intent, to move power from open hands into closed rooms. And isn't that exactly how our world operates today? The decisions that shape your life aren't made in the open. They're whispered at retreats, signed in boardrooms, sealed in chambers you'll never enter. The Whitlocks didn't build skyscrapers, but they built the blueprint for secrecy as power. And the blueprint outlived them. But here's the most unsettling detail. The Whitlocks had a practice called harvest nights. Once a year they wouldn't kill anyone. Instead they'd take notes. They'd watch the valley. They'd see who fought hardest for scraps, who broke down fastest under hunger, who betrayed neighbors first. They believed the greatest resource wasn't land, wasn't food, it was psychology. If you knew how a person broke, you owned them forever. That's not superstition. That's data collection. Tell me, when you scroll your phone, when you click, when you search, what do you think is happening? You're being mapped. Not your body. Your patterns. Your fears. Your weaknesses. Just like those starving farmers, you're studied, logged, categorized. And the harvest never ends. The Whitlocks had ledgers filled with names and traits. Today there are servers filled with your digital self. The methods didn't vanish. They scaled. They industrialized. And now the harvest is global. Legends say that one Whitlock son broke ranks. He fled the valley carrying journals, warnings, maps. He tried to tell outsiders what his family really was. But he wasn't hailed as a whistleblower. He was ridiculed, locked in an asylum, erased. The lesson? Institutions don't protect you from shadow families. Institutions are built by them. The boy's journals allegedly disappeared into a university archive, never to be seen again. And isn't that always the case? Leaks vanish. Testimonies are discredited. Whistleblowers silenced. We've been trained to see these people as lunatics instead of truth-tellers. That's part of the control. You can scream fire, but if the crowd believes you're insane, the flames keep burning. Ask yourself, how many warnings have you ignored? How many headlines about corruption, abuse, hidden experiments, filed away as conspiracy, nonsense, madness? The boy saw the pattern. He tried to warn us, and we let his words rot in the dark. Let's confront the ugliest truth. The Whitlocks didn't fade because of justice. They faded because they evolved. Violence in cabins turned into influence in banks, hospitals, schools. The same families that once ruled valleys now rule infrastructures. Do you think power like that just dies? No, it adapts. The rituals become laws. The symbols become logos. The altars become board tables. Look around. Corporations dictate survival, governments broadcast fear, media mirrors your soul back to you. Does that not feel Whitlock enough? The family was never destroyed. It was absorbed, multiplied, modernized. You don't see their faces anymore because you're not supposed to. They learned invisibility. They don't need hoods or cabins. They wear tailored suits, run nonprofits, sponsor scholarships. The darkness didn't vanish, it polished itself. And the world applauded the polish, never smelling the blood underneath. And so we arrive here, 2025. You sitting in your chair hearing this story thinking, it's just history, just myth. But is it? Or are you recognizing the patterns in your own life? The surveillance, the scarcity, the rituals of fear, the invisible councils deciding your tomorrow. These aren't coincidences. They're inheritances. What began in Appalachian hollows became a global operating system, installed quietly over generations. And now the system is so complete that you don't even see it. You think you're free because you can choose between brands, between channels, between parties. But all those choices are just mirrors, different faces, same reflection. That's the Whitlock gift. The illusion of freedom inside a cage so old and polished you mistake it for home. And the real horror isn't that they exist. It's that you've already adapted. You already live by their rules. And maybe you always have. Faith was always the easiest door for the Whitlocks to walk through. In the valley, they didn't ban religion, they bent it. They whispered into sermons, replaced scripture with parables of obedience, dressed fear as holiness. People didn't realize they weren't praying to God anymore, they were praying to the Whitlocks. And here's the truth, that trick never died. Look around. How many modern churches hoard wealth while their flock starves? How many televangelists preach prosperity while wearing $1,000 suits? This isn't faith. This is feudalism dressed in robes. Religion, at least in the wrong hands, still does exactly what the Whitlocks perfected. It keeps you bowed. Not to the divine. To the human. To the institution. And when you kneel without question, you repeat the same mistake as the valley folk. Mistaking captivity for salvation. Education should free you. But the Whitlocks discovered early that real freedom is dangerous. So they twisted schooling into repetition, obedience, memorization. The Whitlock children never learned truth. They learned compliance. And what about today? From kindergarten bells to standardized tests, you are trained to obey rhythms, not to question them. Schools don't create free thinkers. They manufacture workers. Bells mimic factory horns. Desks mimic cubicles. Grades mimic corporate performance reviews. You're conditioned for hierarchy before you're old enough to know what the word means. The Whitlock system didn't vanish. It became the very structure of education. The myth of meritocracy hides the truth. The cage starts when you're 5, and by the time you're old enough to notice, the bars are already welded shut. Medicine saves lives. But it also decides who lives. The Whitlocks understood that to control a community you don't need to kill, you need to ration care. In the valley they withheld herbs, healers, even clean water, giving only to those who obeyed. And doesn't that sound familiar? Who gets the best doctors today? The rich. Who gets endless bills, endless waiting rooms, endless "we'll call you back"? Everyone else. Health is sold, not given. Access is determined not by need but by your place in the pyramid. Just like the Whitlock Valley, survival depends on your compliance with the system. And when life itself has a price tag that isn't medicine anymore, it's management. You're not a patient. You're an asset. The Whitlocks ran their valley with whispers. Not armies, not guns, stories. They spread rumors of demons in the woods, curses in the river, hauntings in the hills. Fear shapes reality more than truth ever will. And what do you have now? 24-hour cycles of disaster, rage, fear, repeat. Headlines written not to inform but to keep you watching. You don't live in reality, you live in a curated theater. Every story framed, every image chosen, every narrative bent to keep you anxious, divided, consuming. The Whitlocks whispered ghost stories in cabins. Today the ghosts are mass broadcast into your living room. Fear was their oldest tool. It's still the sharpest blade. And the cut is deeper now because it comes wrapped as truth. The valley had its rituals, gatherings, chants, firelight ceremonies. Those were the moments that bound people to the Whitlocks. Shared fear, shared obedience, shared illusion. But what binds us now? The screen. The ritual of scrolling, refreshing, watching. Every glow is a modern altar. You don't kneel in church, you kneel to notifications. You don't whisper chants, you whisper passwords. The Whitlocks would have killed for a tool this perfect. A machine that studies you, entertains you, disciplines you, all at once. And the best part? You bought it yourself. You carry it willingly. You sleep beside it. You wake to its call. The valley needed force to keep its people in line. The modern world doesn't. You hold your leash in your own hand and you tighten it every time you swipe. The Whitlocks didn't need armies, they needed tears. Every man under them was promised power if he obeyed, and every man above was untouchable. That's how you keep people locked in. Give them just enough authority to feel important and just enough fear to never rebel. Look around. That pyramid still stands. The names are different, CEOs, executives, politicians, but the shape is the same. One family at the top, a layer of loyal enforcers beneath, and everyone else stacked like bricks to hold the structure upright. The Whitlocks didn't invent hierarchy, but they perfected it, polished it, and left it behind like a blueprint. And now, you're standing inside the very pyramid they drew, mistaking your position for progress, when really, it's scaffolding for their throne. The Whitlocks vanished, or so the story goes. But legends have a way of spawning imitators. The valley families who escaped carried their trauma outward, spreading seeds of control into new soil. Small towns, corporations, secret societies. The tactics mutated but the essence stayed. Control by fear, loyalty by scarcity, obedience by ritual. You don't need to share the Whitlock bloodline to wear the Whitlock mask. Every time a leader exploits trust, every time a system starves the many to feed the few, that's the Whitlock echo. You don't need their name carved into stone to prove they're still here. The proof is the air you breathe, the very systems you call normal. The imitators aren't a few people in shadows. They're anyone who chooses power over humanity. Why don't you know this story? Why isn't it in the books? Because the Whitlocks didn't just control their valley, they controlled their memory. They erased ledgers, burned journals, rewrote histories. And history hasn't changed. Who tells your stories now? Institutions, governments, corporations. The Whitlock silence never ended, it was perfected. Every erased protest, every redacted document, every algorithm that buries truth under entertainment, it's the same hand stretching across centuries. You were never meant to find this family in the archives. You were meant to forget them entirely. And forgetting is the sharpest weapon of all because if you don't remember the cage, you won't even try to escape it.by now. The picture should be clear. The Whitlocks weren't just people. They were a pattern. A system. A virus that learned to survive by embedding itself into every structure you mistake for order. Faith, education, medicine, media, work. All the pillars that shape your life are stained with their fingerprints. That's why the family never died. You can't kill a structure. You can only see it for what it is. And once you see it, you have a choice. Keep climbing the pyramid or step out of it entirely. But here's the trap. Stepping out isn't simple. Because the pyramid isn't just outside of you. It's inside. Every fear. Every obedience. Every silence. The Whitlocks don't need to rule you anymore. You rule yourself for them. People ask, will the Whitlocks ever return? The truth is, they never left. Their bloodline may be diluted, their mansion rotted, their valley reclaimed by trees. But their structure lives on. In every headline that keeps you afraid. In every paycheck that keeps you obedient. In every ritual of consumption that keeps you distracted. That is the return. Not a family stepping out of the woods, but a family pattern that became the world. And here's the chilling part. Maybe one day someone with their name will step forward, reclaiming what was never truly lost. Maybe they'll smile, extend a hand, and you'll obey without even knowing why. And when that day comes, remember this story. Remember that you weren't supposed to hear it. Because the deadliest Appalachian family didn't vanish into legend. They rewrote reality, and you're living inside it.